During this presentation, Jessica, Britta, and myself, Rachel, will summarize and reflect on the interview with Dr. George Sugai. Dr. Sugai is a professor of special education and a research scientist at the Neek School of Education at the University of Connecticut. His primary research interests include positive behavior supports and interventions for students with problem behaviors. During the interview, Dr. Sugai was asked to categorize his work as nomothetic or idiographic in its approach to intensive intervention. Nomothetic and idiographic refer to differing philosophies in psychology. Psychologists who adopt a nomothetic philosophy are interested in laws or generalizations of human behavior, thinking, or learning. On the other hand, psychologists or social scientists who adopt an idiographic philosophy are interested in studying aspects of human behavior, thinking, or learning unique to each individual. As you can see, having a nomothetic versus idiographic philosophy can impact how a scientist studies and designs intensive intervention. Instead of viewing these two as a dichotomy, most psychologists place themselves somewhere along these two as a continuum. Jessica will discuss more about how Dr. Sugai views his work and his view on intensive intervention as nomothetic or idiographic in the next slide.
Many of the faculty members that were interviewed struggled to definitively place themselves into one category or another. Sugai was no different. He expressed that based on his research interests and PBIS experiences, he would categorize himself as nomothetic. However, in the beginning, he had to Google the definitions, and through that, he found that he identified with the tenets of idiographic. Lee Swanson was also unsure of the definitions, and how one identifies to it is based on the realm of their research. He wanted to identify through the medical field for our definitions and chose nomothetic after some discussion. Lee Swanson's research really is in the area of cognitive mechanisms, and he felt that we needed to further study the area of learning disabilities and how those students do what they do and how they struggle with what they struggle with, and how they're successful yet struggle to read, and what routes are they taking in order to be successful and function like they do. He thinks that we also need to identify the variables that would moderate the treatment outcomes for intensive interventions in order for us to be able to intensify what it is that we're doing on those lower levels of the tiers. In her interview, Simmons also picked nomothetic because of the nature of her research, just like Sugai picked it for his PBIS research. Simmons looks at the design of an instructional approach. Their data looks at and identifies content that is not mastered, and then they regroup to create more homogeneous groups of students. In this way, they address the deficiencies with the design of instructions instead of the process, such as the example she gave was working memory or intervention design. Marcia Barnes also wanted to be a fence sitter, but if she was forced to choose, she selected nomothetic because she felt, based on her research, that there was only so many ways that you could carve up human cognition, and there were only so many causal factors for an area of disability. Her research are treatment by aptitude interactions, and she wants to know if we're looking at the right place for the answer to our questions. So, for example, she said there really aren't that many areas that we're looking at with math and that many lines of questioning, yet we're looking at all of these things with reading, but most of those are with comprehension. And should maybe we be looking at decoding? And through that, there are only so many ways to carve up a skill in order to get good development of that skill. All of this, she says, comes down to cognitive psychology and where the brain is set up to do a certain number of things, and its functions really are limited. So all of this comes down to where she said she really, if she had to pick, would pick nomothetic. Much like Sugai said, if he had to pick based on his research and what he does, he would also pick nomothetic. Another point that really stood out to me, though, from Barnes's talk was where she said that we needed to look at what is working in the intervention work that we're doing. They came down to calling it a component analysis. That really jumped out, so I made note of that in this.
Dr. Sugai made a few key points during his interview. These relate both to his views on intensive intervention and also reflect how his views adopt both a nomothetic and idiographic philosophy. First, reflecting a more nomothetic philosophy, Dr. Sugai pointed out how it's critical to understand the mechanism behind the phenomenon we are studying. Second, Dr. Sugai discussed how, if a student doesn't respond to an intervention, we should ask ourselves as scientists and practitioners a few questions. These questions reflect both an idiographic and nomothetic philosophy. First, idiographically, we should make sure we understand the learner and how he or she is responding and performing. Second, we need to make sure we have a good hypothesis about the mechanism behind the behavior or learning we are studying. This reflects a more nomothetic philosophy, while the first point reflects a more idiographic philosophy. Third, we need to examine the intervention and what needs to be changed in order to achieve the desired result for this individual student. Dr. Sugai also discussed the importance of teaching the learner or how to respond in environments outside of the instructional environment. For example, making sure the changes in behavior can generalize outside a particular classroom or clinical setting.
Dr. Sugai discussed the wraparound model used for PBIS and mentioned the possible application of such a model to other interventions. He described a wraparound model as a comprehensive approach to supporting a student's learning in multiple areas of their life through intentional peer, parent, and community supports. One question we have is how might a researcher begin to create and research such a model, and how might a researcher best determine what key factors to include? Additionally, when developing or using a wraparound model, how can buy-in be optimized from the entire community involved while remaining culturally responsive? Dr. Sugai discussed creating interventions which are relevant even in Jamaica. In other words, interventions should be flexible enough to be relevant to a wide variety of environments. We are wondering how to ensure interventions are both effective and efficient while still remaining relevant to the population being served.
Britta, Jessica, and myself, Rachel, reflected on this interview with Dr. Sugai. Here are a few of our key takeaway points. First, theory is important for understanding why behavior or learning is or is not occurring. Misunderstanding theory or not being aware of theory can lead to interventions that are poorly designed and ineffective.
Taking a nomothetic or idiographic approach to our research isn't a clear dichotomy, but rather the focus should be somewhere in the middle, where we utilize both approaches. Dr. Sugai frequently referred to central tenets of learning and discussed how researchers need to understand and adhere to these central tenets, being a nomothetic approach. But when looking at an individual student's needs, interventions are intensified through an ideographic approach to altering instruction to meet the individual needs of that child.
Lastly, we may have a personal theory that we follow that makes us inclined to have either a more nomothetic or ideographic approach to our research. However, we should be flexible. Our desired outcomes, instead of a rigid view of how learning or behavior occurs, should drive which approach we take for each particular student and circumstance.